The NBA has always been a growing league and is eventually going to eclipse the NFL as the biggest sport in America, especially with how the league has become more progressive over the past few seasons.
Edwards. Oh, Edwards! A signature slam!
One of the things that Commissioner Adam Silver has been looking at is expanding the NBA to new cities, considering that the league is now growing at an unprecedented rate. There are now a lot of talented players fighting for roster spots throughout the league, and many teams have been increasing their values to hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars. That makes it clear to the league that there is room for more teams in the NBA. So if you want to know the cities that are likely going to have their own NBA teams, you might want to stick around for a few minutes. From the late 80s up to the early 2000s, the NBA saw a massive expansion that allowed several teams to enter the league. The 90s saw the Grizzlies and Raptors joining the NBA. Meanwhile, in 2004, the league expanded to Charlotte after the Charlotte Hornets moved to New Orleans in 2002. In that regard, it's been 20 years since the last time a new NBA franchise joined the league.
Not temporary. Here's Smith. He sets up the slam dunk.
Of course, a league of 30 teams actually looks good, as it allows all 6 divisions to have 5 NBA teams each. We've already gotten used to having 15 teams in the West and 15 teams in the East battling one another. For years, it looked like adding more teams in the league would just mess the entire scenario up. So, since the league added the Charlotte Bobcats in 2004, the NBA has been more focused on making the sport a more global league, expanding its horizons in African and Asian countries, while continuing to improve its relationship with Mexico, South America, and Europe. This has allowed the NBA to become a more global product, especially with the influx of international players who have gone on to become some of the best stars in the league. But the league hasn't turned its back on a possible expansion, considering that America still has a lot of different cities that are rabid basketball and sports fans in general. After all, the only reason why the NBA allowed the Seattle Supersonics to move to Oklahoma City in 2008 was because OKC looked like it was ready for an NBA team when the Hornets franchise played there temporarily for a season. In fact, there are still plenty of untapped markets in the US. In that regard, Commissioner Adam Silver has been vocal about the possibility of adding more teams to the league, especially now that the NBA is growing in talent. Each of the 30 NBA teams is allowed to have 15 players, making it clear that there are only a few limited slots open for some of the best basketball players in the world. But with the talent level growing and with many different stars jammed onto one team, it's looking like the league needs to spread the talent more by adding at least 2 more teams. The first 2 teams that the NBA has been looking at are familiar destinations. Let's start with Seattle, which is arguably the most familiar NBA destination to a lot of fans. For younger fans out there, the OKC Thunder used to play in Seattle as the Supersonics for decades. It was only in 2008 that the franchise moved to OKC due to the new owner's wishes and because Seattle failed to fund the construction of a new arena. But for decades, the Sonics franchise was a staple in Seattle, as this city has always loved its Sonics team. That means that there is no problem when it comes to finding a proper fan base for a possible return of the NBA to Seattle. The second city that is likely going to get its very own NBA team is Las Vegas. For a lot of people, Vegas isn't the ideal place to put an NBA team because it's not a big city. In most cases, it's just a vacation town where a lot of people go during the weekends to enjoy gambling or a few good nights of partying. But there aren't a lot of people actually living in Vegas, as most of the folks you see there only stay there for a couple of days before saying, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But the one thing that the NBA has been interested in when it comes to a possible expansion franchise in Vegas is the growth of sports gambling. The league has been openly promoting sports gambling because it can't deny that it brings a lot of money to the NBA and has helped it grow over the past few years. Of course, we can't deny the fact that Las Vegas is still the biggest gambling city in the world, with millions of dollars moving in and out of casinos on a regular basis.
An NBA team be the next pro sports franchise to come to Las Vegas.
So while Vegas isn't the most attractive sports city in the world, it's one of the most lucrative cities for an NBA team, especially when it comes to the big bucks that the league would be earning from gambling revenues. We've already seen the likes of the WNBA and the NFL trying their hand at Vegas, and it's likely that the NBA is up next. Over in the East, we may see a return to New Jersey. Remember that the move that the Nets made from New Jersey to Brooklyn is more of an ownership decision than anything. New Jersey still has a lot of rabid basketball fans ready to welcome a new NBA team. Because of that, there's a good chance that the league would look at this city for a new NBA franchise. Then there's San Diego, which isn't the biggest city in California, but is a favorite among NBA players because of its fine weather, good people, and great beaches. San Diego used to be the home of the Clippers before they moved to Los Angeles. But the problem is that San Diego isn't really big on sports. It's more likely to be a spot where NBA players would want to live in. But the league would rather focus on possible revenues instead of putting their players in the best cities in the country. But while the commissioner has referenced Seattle, Vegas, and a few other American cities in the past, he never made it clear that he's planning to expand the league in those cities. In fact, he even said that he's also looking at expanding into cities outside the United States. The first two countries that come to mind are Canada and Mexico.
Mexico City one day, but there's lots of other U.S. cities and Canadian cities, frankly, that have reached out to us.
It goes without saying that the Toronto Raptors have been successful in the NBA since joining the league in the middle of the 90s. They saw the rise of the high-flying Vince Carter before becoming perennial playoff contenders. And in 2019, the Raptors became the first NBA team outside of the U.S. to win the NBA championship, proving that a non-US team can compete at the highest level in this league. Of course, we've already seen the Vancouver Grizzlies folding. Due to a low attendance rate and a weak Canadian dollar, the Grizzlies moved from Vancouver to Memphis, leaving the Raptors as the only NBA franchise outside of the USA. Since then, the league has been a bit careful about putting an NBA team outside of American borders. Nevertheless, the growth of basketball in Canada, with the rise of Canadian stars, has allowed the NBA to consider returning to Vancouver with a new franchise. Meanwhile, Mexico City seems like a good place to put an NBA team in Mexico, as the league has been improving its relationship with its Mexican fans over the years. While basketball isn't quite as big as soccer in Mexico, and despite the fact that there have been 5 Mexican players in the league since the dawn of time, Silver is really intent on bringing the NBA there. The problem, however, is that there are going to be a lot of logistical and security challenges if the NBA were to bring a team to Mexico. Traveling in and out of this country would be very hard, especially with how infamous Mexico is in the drug trade world. Let's not forget that Mexico City is quite far from a lot of NBA teams. There's also the fact that Mexico isn't the safest country, especially with the cartel roaming around. NBA players love vacationing in Mexico because of the country's beaches. But let's be real about the fact that these players are going to be fearing for their lives and properties if they stay in Mexico. This would make it difficult for a Mexican NBA team to keep a player on a long-term contract or even attract free agents to play for Mexico City. So, while it would be nice to see the game of basketball growing in Mexico, the risks-to-reward ratio might not be in favor of the NBA, especially with the challenges they have to face when putting a team in that country. Still, Silver believes that an NBA team in Mexico City is very doable, especially because he sees this as the gateway to Latin America, possibly allowing the sport to grow and expand further down south to South America. But at this point, it's likely that the NBA is looking at more familiar markets and cities in the United States and Canada instead of going all out on the globalization of the league in other countries. This means that an expansion project would have to start on American shores before the league would want to look at putting an NBA team in Mexico or even other countries such as London or France. Of course, it looks like expansion isn't in the books for at least another 2 years, especially because the league is currently in a good place. But if the NBA were to look at expanding its horizons, we're probably looking at a return to Seattle or a trip to Vegas.